Now let's take a look at how to configure our serial interfaces if we have our routers connected back to back via a serial cable. Assuming once again that we're starting from the user mode prompt, we would type in the word enable to put us into privilege mode. Here in privilege mode, you want to verify which end of the cable is plugged into the router that you're configuring. In order to do this, you issue the command show controllers serial 0. Now, this is an interesting command right here because in other situations, we could always just type in interface S0 or E0 without putting a space between the S and the 0 or the serial and 0. Here in this particular instance, a little strange syntax situation occurs where you actually have to be sure that there's a space between the S and the 0 or the serial and the 0. So, to verify whether your cable is DCE, data communications equipment, or data terminal equipment, DTE, you issue the command show controllers S0 or serial 0. This is going to show you whether there's a cable attached. It'll show you what type of cable, whether it's V35, etc. It will also show you whether or not the cable that's attached to your serial interface is a DCE or DTE end of the cable. If it is the DCE end of the cable, often you will also see the clock rate if the clock rate has been configured. What is the clock rate? The clock rate is the rate of communications that is agreed upon between the two devices. Why don't we normally have to configure the clock rate? Well, if your router is connected to a CSU-DSU device, that device is going to provide the clocking or the rate of communication. If two devices are going to communicate at layer 1, at the physical layer, they must agree upon the rate of communication, the clock rate. So, when connecting two routers back to back, one of those two devices would be specified as the DCE, the device that sets the clocking. So, depending on which end of the cable is plugged into your router, will determine whether your router is the DCE or the DTE. So once you've issued the show controllers command, you'll be able to determine whether your router is the DCE or DTE. Upon determining that, say for instance this router is the DCE. Let's now configure the serial interface for communication. Here at the privilege mode prompt, we would issue the command config T or configure terminal to put us into global configuration mode. That global configuration mode is indicated with the config prompt here. Now we indicate the interface that we want to configure, interface serial 0. That puts us in interface configuration mode. That's indicated there with the config-if. Now we can configure the IP address here. IP address 10.1.1.5, and we'll, for space purposes, put the subnet mask under the command. But keep in mind, this really is all on the same line. All on the same line. IP address, the address itself, and the subnet mask. You press enter. We're still in interface configuration mode here. At this point, you can issue the command clock rate. A lot of times what I like to do is do a clock rate and a question mark here. Keep in mind the question mark key is a self-executable command that will indicate the different ways that you could complete the syntax. This will provide you with all of the different clock rates or all of the different valid clock rates on the router that you're configuring. The clock rate, once you've determined what valid clock rate would be, the clock rate would be indicated. Say for instance we want 56K, 56,000. So clock rate 56,000. Let me move that over so we can see that. Clock rate 56,000. Press enter. Notice we're still at the config if prompt, the interface configuration mode prompt, at which point now I can issue the command no shut or no shutdown to enable the interface. And then I could issue the Control Z, or I could type in end, END, which would put me back at the privilege mode prompt here. So let's just assume we did Control Z right here. Control Z. That puts us back at the privilege mode prompt, at which point I can issue a show run command to see my configuration. Remember the show run command, this is the running configuration loaded or located in the RAM. This will show all of the configuration of all of my interfaces along with the rest of the router. I can issue the show interface serial 0 command to see the configuration that I have here. In order to see that clock rate, though, I would have to once again put in that show controllers command that I used before. If you didn't see a clock rate here, you should see a clock rate now, depending on the iOS that you're using on your particular router. Connecting routers back to back via serial cable is a unique situation. Oftentimes you'll see that implementation being used in a server room where you have a self-contained network, or you would see it in a lab environment.